Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us at Udden Club today. I hope you all are having a good week too. Before we get started, does anyone have any announcements they'd like to share? We're good? Okay, awesome. So I'm just gonna read a short little bio about our speaker here, Dr. Jeremy Hoffman. He graduated from Augustana in 2011 with a major in geology and a minor in classics, and received his PhD in geology with a focus on paleoclimatology from Oregon State University. Jeremy served as the climate and earth scientist at the Museum of Virginia before leaving in May 2023 to begin work with Groundwork USA as their Director of Climate Justice and Impact. As an engaging climate scientist and educator, Dr. Hoffman specializes in earth science communication, data-driven and community-based science, connecting people to our planet, exploring urban heat islands, and environmental racism. He has given presentations and interviews to congressional committees, TEDx youth audiences, and the New York Times, and was lead author of the 5th National Climate Assessment Southeast Chapter, and was recently named a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. We welcome Dr. Hoffman to Udden Geology Club today and thank him for his continued interest in and connection with the Augustana Geology Department.
Hello, Rock Island! This is incredible. Thank you so much for coming on your Friday afternoon to come and learn a little bit about what I do and what my research group has done over the last about 10 years. To give you a little bit of background on myself, I was a member of the Udden Club, obviously. I was the jester, the vice president, and the president of the illustrious Udden Club. I was in the Augustana Choir. Anybody else in the Augustana Choir? Hey! And I was an honorary member of Delta Omega Nu. Is there any other nods in the room? Got right on. So I work in kind of the intersection between science and society, specifically how climate science interacts with our society. And if you've never taken really a class in like urban planning or anything, I want to break down a couple of those sorts of like systems that are at work to create the world that we walk through. Every single day, every minute of your life is experienced through walking among thousands, if not millions, of decisions that someone else made for you around your space. And in that way, we know that we can link a location directly to people's life outcomes. So I've dedicated the last about 10 years to understanding more about the linkages between the decisions that we make in the design where we live and the outcomes that are relevant to people, including how long. So in order to get started in that conversation, if you want to just click on that screen so it's like selected on this so I can go forward. Yeah, there we go. I have to embarrass myself a little bit first. So I come into climate science from a experience of being an outdoorsy person. Now beyond the great fashion sense that you see in this photo, the key thing was my family was really heavily involved in going outside. I still am a fisherman. My dad would take me on daily fishing trip or yearly fishing trips to northwestern Wisconsin, and even over just the course of my life, the lakes that I grew up fishing in have shifted dramatically in their species composition and the kinds of species of fish that are living in them. Namely, it's gone from one of the fish on this stringer here was a walleye, which is a bottom-feeding, really delicious, yummy freshwater fish. Those species have largely been outcompeted by the largemouth bass. Why does that matter? Well, it turns out largemouth bass really like the warm lakes versus the cold lake preference of the walleye. Now, why does this matter? I grew up with my dad making me fish and eggs for breakfast. And now I have a 3-year-old niece. And I don't have the same opportunity to share that experience intergenerationally between her and me, and then my dad, who's her grandfather. And I think to me, really, climate change speaks to an intergenerational justice issue. Those of us that are in the room that are under 36 years old have never lived on the planet when the global average monthly temperature was below the 20th century average. 36 years old. We have inherited a world that is systematically warmer and affected by global climate change. This is one of the best and dramatic representations of that, where the blues correspond to cooler than normal years, red corresponds to warmer than normal years, and we're going from 1850 to about 2020 far right. Every single year is basically among the top 5 warmest years on record. 2024 is almost without a doubt going to go down as the warmest year on record. And it's not even over yet. You know, it's not even October. But we know, because of the physics of the climate system, that we can predict within a reasonable amount of confidence that these sorts of year-like anomalies are going to continue. Now, in order to understand what that means for us, we tend to rely on things like scientific reports. You've probably heard about things like the IPCC, AR5 or AR6. Those are really big international efforts to distill the findings of the last about 5 or 6 years worth of climate science into digestible take-home points, and then longer narratives around the evidence base. We do that same thing in the United States in a program that's called the National Climate Assessment. I was the Southeast chapter lead, which is a huge honor to get the opportunity to try and manage a group of scientists to do that. And if you're interested, it came out in November, so you might not even know that it existed, but I implore you to take a look, nca2023.publishing.gov. They have chapters on regions, so if you're not even, there's a Midwest chapter, for example. You can look at what are the latest projections for the future of the Midwest. There's also topic-related chapters, things like transportation, built environment, agriculture. So pick and choose what kind of topics you want to learn about. I encourage you to go to that website to learn more. But I can actually distill everything that we said in our chapter down to 5 emojis. We are already experiencing and then expecting a hotter, wetter, sneezier, wheezier climate. We're going to talk a lot about hotter for the rest of the talk as a way to get into the discussion about where we live. But quickly, I just want to say, wetter. I live in Virginia, only about an hour from the coast. As the global climate has warmed up, it melts ice that's on land. That water is now transferred into the ocean. Sea level goes up globally. At the same time, the global climate is getting warmer. That heat is mostly being absorbed by the ocean. I think it's over 100 billion atomic bombs worth of energy is absorbed by the ocean. So thank you, ocean, for keeping the climate relatively less changed than it would be otherwise. As that warms up, it actually fills a greater volume. So we have 2 things going on at once that raise global sea levels. Locally on the east coast of North America, we also have oceanographic currents that make it relatively worse or better depending on where you are. In Virginia, it tends to make it worse. Now, also wetter in the sense that places like this, where we don't have an ocean, we see an intensification of the water cycle. We have a thirstier atmosphere, actually hold more water in it. And then when the rain happens, especially extreme rainfall, there's a little bit more water over a shorter amount of time, creating more risky situations like flooding. There's been built confidence in the attribution of extreme rainfall events to attendant flooding due to climate. Now, a wheezier climate, or a sneezier climate, we actually know across the United States, we have a longer and stronger allergy season. If anybody around the month of April starts to get all like red eyes, like me, or your car gets covered in that yellow dust, those are the evidences of an intensified pollen season. Now, that becomes important for children because actually they breathe more air per unit body mass than adults do. So that's, again, another intergenerational justice issue. Children have done nothing to create the climate that we live in, but they're bearing some of the most serious outcomes. Then lastly, wheezier climate. Where I live in Virginia, 2 years ago in the summer, there were these really dazzlingly red and dramatic sunsets. And everybody was like, I wonder what, and then wildfire smoke from Canada drifted on rivers of air and subsided into the mid-Atlantic, causing the worst air quality events we've had in 25 years. All because of a fire 3,000 miles away. Now, all else being equal, we expect the likelihood and intensity of wildfires to continue to increase. So by the trend of the topic, we should also see more of these sorts of air quality events where it's good for the future. So we're talking about, again, hotter, wetter, Sneezier and Wheezier. Let's talk a little bit about hotter. Heat is really hard to deal with for a lot of reasons. The most important being, a lot of people die from it. It's actually the most acute weather-related mortality hazard, more so than any of those other weather-related extremes. And what's crazy to me is that we tend to hear a lot more about things like hurricanes, right? We can see them on the satellite. We can watch the news reporter go outside and say, I'm reporting live from Tampa, and oh my God. We give them names. It is so easy to pay attention to something when you've given it a name. We do none of those things. We do not name heat waves. It's really hard to do because each region is different. People are different from region to region. The intensity of the expected climatology behind heat waves is different. So that makes that a really big challenge. And that is partially why we have such an extreme burden on mortality on heat. But what's more important than that is who is dying and where do they live? And we learned a lot from a heat wave in 1995 in the city of Chicago. I was about 7 years old when this happened. And about 750 people died over a 3-day weekend, or a three-day span of time over a weekend in July. It was over 100 degrees Fahrenheit for several days on end. It didn't drop below 80 degrees overnight for like 4 nights in a row. 750 people lost their lives as a direct result of this extreme heat event. Now, that sounds like a bad thing, right? It is, to lose that many people. But really what's underneath that is who these people were and where they lived. And this picture tells a lot of that story. In fact, if you read a book called Heat Wave by Eric Kleinenberg, you'll learn a lot more about this particular heat wave than just about every, or what we learned from this one about any other heat wave up to that time. And that was that elderly members of communities of color on the southwestern side of Chicago had relatively higher mortality rates than just about any other similarly aged and composed neighborhood. Saying that again, the most marginalized parts of the urban system suffered disproportionately high rates of death during this heat wave. Turns out, 25 years later, COVID-19 hit these exact same neighborhoods at higher rates and mortality rates. The same neighborhood. So there's something about these places that link 1995 with the present, two completely unrelated things seemingly affecting the exact same people in a more acute way. That points to something tying these places together in a very unique way. And we know that heat doesn't just play the same note in every scale. We know heat affects different places differently. So I need your help. John Deere Pavilion, or John Deere Planetarium, I need your help. Think in your head, if we were going to fly into this picture like we're on the Magic School Bus, and I'm Miss Frizzle, and I've given you the responsibility to go and find the warmest place, the warmest thing to the touch. Think in your head what it is. The warmest spot to the touch in this picture. On 3, I want you to yell it out so nobody feels embarrassed if they got it wrong or not. 1, 2, 3. Boy, that was a lot of different words. Jeff, I don't know if you could hear that, but that was kind of like, ugh. All right, how about this? On the flip side of that, you have to go and find the coolest spot to the touch, okay? Coolest spot to the touch. On 3. 1, 2, 3. Jeff, did you hear a much more strong consensus from that one? I think we all know that like on a really hot day, you want to be under a tree. It's just part of our evolutionary psychology or something. I don't really know that for sure, and if there's an evolutionary psychologist in the room, please don't lambast me on it. But I think we all kind of just know that the coolest place is going to be the shadiest, right? Well, I heard a lot of different answers for where the hottest is going to be. So let's actually test your hypotheses, because you just made them. Congratulations, you're scientists. We can test them with the tools of science, including forward-looking infrared cameras called FLIR cameras. I actually know Dr. Burnham was using them in her class this afternoon. And we can actually look at the urban environment in a whole new way. So on 3, we're going to reveal the temperatures on this picture, all right? 1, 2, 3. The brighter colors here are the hotter temperatures. The blue or purples, darker colors are going to be the cooler temperatures. It's about 115 degree Fahrenheit difference between the hottest and coolest surface in this photo. You can see a lot of different interesting stuff going on. First, I think, of course, this old mature oak tree, quintessential southern tree, you know, just a beautiful specimen, a couple hundred years old, very cool underneath that tree, of course. Then this patch of asphalt, this kind of asphalt parking lot, by far the warmest thing. But then it's really everything else in between those two extremes where this picture gets interesting. Look at this spot here versus the grass here. So we've got this, that's a native plant garden. That's known as Bayscape Garden at the Science Museum of Virginia. Those are native plants to coastal or Piedmont, Virginia. They became used to and evolved in times of drought and extreme heat. So they have really deep roots to pull water out of the ground much deeper in the soil, allowing them to evapotranspire well into an extended drought and heat event. Meanwhile, these non-native European grasses have very, very small-scale root systems. And so they dry out and, interestingly, become as hot as the concrete. Then, of course, all the different colors of the cars. You know, you got the family van, you got the irresponsibly large truck in an urban environment. Those all have different colors because of well, they all have different temperatures because of their colors, right? This is all about reflectivity to the sun's energy. So as albedo. Higher albedo surfaces reflect more of that incoming energy. Meanwhile, low albedo surfaces absorb more of it and then can actually re-emit it back to the air as heat throughout the afternoon and into the evening. That causes particular places that have a dominance of these kinds of hard, dark surfaces to become much warmer than those places that have much more shade. It seems really simple, but what we didn't know was the degree to which those things actually matter for temperature. And so there are charts like this one that you see in the NCAA 5. If you go to NCAA2023.gov to read the report that I was a lead author on, there is a variety of different categories of things and how much they change the temperature of the place. Depends largely on where you are in different climates. So with my friend Vivek Chandas, we got a group of community members together in the city of Richmond, Virginia in 2017 to use his methodology, which basically stick thermometers on cars and drive around during a heat wave. And then we'll take all the temperature data and all the location data and feed it into a model that predicts then what the temperature would be given the land use that we didn't directly observe. And on that day, we had just the best opportunity to do science. It was just such a lovely experience. We had youth members working with city sustainability officers. We had university professors riding with residents that had lived in Richmond for 35 years. And we found a 16-degree Fahrenheit difference between the coolest and warmest place on the exact same moment. 16 degrees Fahrenheit was more than some places saw over the course of the day. So the intra-city variation was larger than the diurnal variation. That's incredible. You don't know Richmond? Is anybody from Richmond, Virginia? No. So I'm not going to tell you any of the landmarks or anything, but you can see some places that are warm, some places that are cool, right? Well, we've done some follow-up work that's super raising our understanding of how we can use these data to actually affect change. One of those being that we worked with the Ambulance Authority. We basically asked the VDH, the Virginia Department of Health, can you send us a map of where you go in the ambulance for heat-related illness responses? And they said, sure. There's that map. The correspondence of these things, even when correcting for population density, remains the same. It's more likely than not, if you suffer a heat illness in the city of Richmond, you are in a hotter than citywide average place. So, okay, we know a lot about that. Turns out you're also probably within a 10-minute walk of the city cooling center or community center. So you have a community asset to keep you safe, but you're not using it. That tells us even more about particular pieces of this story. Another really important thing, remember going back to Chicago, was elderly members of communities of color. You need to disaggregate this health data by race to get at the underlying patterns between social groups in the city of Richmond. And what we find is that Black and African American residents make up over 60% of the total cases of these heat-related illnesses, but only make up about 45% of the population. Meanwhile, white residents only make up about 37% of the cases. Meanwhile, they are also about 45%. This overrepresentation of Black individuals versus white individuals in these heat-related illness data is a clear example of an environmental injustice issue. It's almost definition of what that means when it comes to extreme heat. Now, when I talked about Chicago and those same neighborhoods were coming up in the heat wave and in COVID-19, it turns out those same neighborhoods that we see elevated amounts of heat-related illness, we see that same thing in Richmond. It turns out in every city that we went to go do our heat mapping campaigns, that same pattern of historically Black communities experiencing hotter than average temperatures held true 100% of the time. Virtually no city has a situation where the trend is reversed. And so we started putting together, like, what's the story here? I'm a geologist by training, right here at Augustana College. I'm interested in knowing the story behind an observation. Well, we worked with the urban planning department at urban planning researcher at the University of Richmond, who just digitized a bunch of maps. Has anybody ever seen a redlining map before? Yes. All right. A lot of us. I'll be brief, but no, I could talk your ear off about this at much more length. And if you're a senior coming to dinner with us, perhaps we will. But basically, these maps were drawn on behalf of a federally backed project, which we call the Homeowners Loan Corporation, their city project. Anyway, what they were given the authority to do was to go walk around cities and describe particular places and then rate them on a scale from A to D. And much like our grades in school, A was the best, D was the worst. In fact, they were even called hazardous. And what they were trying to rate was their security for financial investment. Basically, do these neighborhoods deserve access, or are they going to be able to get home loans, mortgage insurance, other forms of generational wealth building tools that we associate in the present day with home ownership? But while they were supposed to be rating these on a completely and totally totally objective scale, it actually turns out when you read about the places that got red lines, especially in the Southeast United States, it was almost entirely based on the skin color of the people that were living there. Here in the Midwest and the Northeast, it had more to do with, are you an immigrant just in general? On the West Coast, it had a lot to do with the same thing. It's xenophobic, classist, and racist opinions about whether or not a neighborhood would receive attention in financial investment. It's a really, really interesting process, and it has led to innumerable ills for these particular neighborhoods. And if you're interested in learning more about that process, there's a book called The Color of Law by, I forget exactly, I'm saying Richard Rothstein is coming to my head, but in any case, the book is called The Color of Law, and you should absolutely read it. Well, is my clicker not working anymore? Give me a nice click. There we go. So economists have been studying the long-term outcomes of these redlining versus greenlining for a few years now, and coming up with really robust conclusions about the cohort-based outcomes of these practices. Basically saying, if you were born and then grew up in a redline neighborhood, you are now more likely to not own your home, have lower credit score, have less access to health care, have less educational attainment, have less median income. It's by virtually any socioeconomic indicator, people born and raised and then raising their families in a redline neighborhood have significantly lower socioeconomic outcomes in people born in green line areas. Now, so we asked the question, what do these things look like when the people are describing these places at the time? They actually wrote down notes, and we could read their notes. Turns out A and B neighborhoods were referred to in their area descriptions as being wooded and shaded, and then golf. The proximity of wealth and golf. Someone's got to write a book about that. But C and D neighborhoods, on the other hand, were already being referred to as manufacturing and paved and hot and sewers. In the present day, we refer to these as environmental justice neighborhoods. They were already looking like this in some way. And so I'm not saying that redlining, this process of redlining, made these things happen. But what it did was to lock them in place and make it lawful to reinforce those patterns. Because what happened after redlining was a series of additional nefarious urban planning policies that occurred. But you might be asking yourself, because you're all environmentally minded, and many of you are geologists, what came before that? If you want to watch the most mind-blowing discussion of why cities look the way that they do, you should watch this TED Talk by Stephen DeBerry, basically going into how the spin of the earth itself may help us better understand how residential sorting patterns were playing out during the Industrial Revolution. Basically, wind moves in both hemispheres from west to east, blowing pollution from the west side of a city to the east side. And here in Richmond, Virginia, we have a neighborhood on the west side of the city that's called Bon Air. It's a living example of that very thing. So anyway, we published a paper in 2020 where we showed that these formerly redlined areas were significantly warmer than their non-redlined neighbors during summer. And we tried to disentangle what the underlying land use patterns were, and these places were predominantly paved over and had many, many fewer trees. So that exact phenomenon that you all called out from that thermal photo is exactly what we see at the scale of cities. And it doesn't just stop in Richmond. In 94% of the cities that were in the database, this relationship held. 94% of the cities, formerly redlined areas, are warmer than their non-redlined neighbors. Now, a bunch of other studies have come out since to enrich the story. Now, once you have kind of the main story settled, details become important for what you then do with policy. So in this case, not only are there fewer trees, but the trees that are present in formerly redlined areas are physically shorter. They're smaller. They take up less volume. So even if they do exist, they are, less efficient air conditioners. They're less efficient sponges for stormwater. Every good thing we think about as a tree is diminished in these places relative to their non-redline neighbors. And it doesn't just stop there, because remember, it's hotter, wetter. This is a map that's blue anywhere that the FEMA risk map for flooding is underestimated in relation to a high resolution flood model. Basically saying blue areas, FEMA doesn't estimate the full and total risk of flooding from precipitation extremes. You might be still disappointed, but not surprised, based on the rest of this talk, that formerly redlined areas have many more parcels in them that suffer a high flood risk in this particular case. So not only are these neighborhoods hotter, but they are wetter. That study actually kind of got the attention of Redfin, the website where millennials go to dream about housing ownership. And so they actually highlighted a bit of our research. Hotter, wetter, Sneezier and Wheezier, right? Well, I mentioned that after redlining, there was a whole series of other things that happened. Things like urban renewal, which basically gave cities carte blanche to remove entire neighborhoods that they deemed to be, what do they call it? Slums. And so they would clear out entire neighborhoods to make way for the invention of the future, the highway. Yes, redline neighborhoods were chosen as the pathway for many of the interstates that now go through and around our cities. So what does that do? That disproportionately exposes anybody that's left there to higher amounts of traffic-related pollution. So this study here showed that NO2, which is a major contributor to the EPA's air quality index, is significantly higher than in non-redlined areas. A study that just came out the other day shows that even as air quality has gotten better, the differences between these areas continue to remain, simply because of their proximity to these environmental disamenities. And then this paper came out, which I'm just going to let you guys read that for a second. No, I'm just kidding. They do a really great review of how to get from the policies of the early planning that informed redlining to show that over time, these built environment and social and socioeconomic factors, things like vacant spaces and less green space, proximity to pollution, and so on, linking these indicators in redlined areas to their non-redlined neighbors, and then showing how these are now in the medical literature being linked to real-world health outcomes, including shorter life expectancy. Things like asthma, cancer, COVID-19, chronic diseases, and of course, heat-related illnesses. These places are destined by the history of that place to make people sick. So, what am I trying to say is these places, even if climate change had never happened, let's imagine we took all of the CO2 that we put in the atmosphere. Well, I say the royal we, not us in this room. But we take all the CO2 that's been put into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution, and you bring climate back down a degree, 0.2 Celsius. And what still exists? These differences. All of the differences I just described to you are largely independent of a changing climate. They would exist even if climate change wasn't a thing. But if you add the risks of a changing climate on top of that, you can start to see how this is a compounding risk that is rooted in environmental injustice. And so, even without climate change, there are neighbors in our places that are experiencing a hotter, wetter, sneezier and wheezier environment. And that has a direct impact on their health. So what do we do now? This is probably the most fun part of the talk because I can see you all glazing over like, what are we gonna do? What are we gonna do? Well, we have a bunch of options, it turns out. We can return nature back into cities. One huge option that not only reduces temperatures, but also soaks up stormwater. These sorts of investments can be prioritized in neighborhoods that have been left out of those discussions, given the opportunity to actually install and maintain those practices and actually make some wealth out of the economic impact of those practices. But you can see these different natural infrastructure things like greenways and urban forests and blue spaces have attendant adaptation co-benefits that are directly related to improving human health. So we can look at nature as a somewhat of a salve to these environmental injustices. Now, but that's just one of many options we have. We can also engage people in understanding, using, and advocating around environmental data. One thing we created, what are you going to do with it? We have this program called RD Air. We put sensors on people. We walked around our city along a busy intersection, busy stretch of Broad Street and into a leafy green neighborhood to go into a little park. These two walks are within blocks of each other. We all started from the same place, about one of two blocks. We did that again the following week, randomly assigning people between those two treatments. We recorded their physiology as they walked among these different environments. And even just showing you this picture, you should probably get an idea of what the outcomes are going to be. But even I was pretty shocked. Not only did they experience higher amounts of pollution, this is PM 2.5 data collected along that busy street versus in the leafy green neighborhood. It's the difference of about 20 micrograms per cubic meter just within a couple blocks. It backs up decades of research on proximity to traffic and its exposure to extreme amounts of air pollution. Excuse me, but also it was louder. Being closer to the traffic made it louder. Jeremy. But that has huge cascading impacts on people's mental health and well-being. Now, also, it was significantly cooler. Yeah, you told us that already. But this was by several degrees Celsius that these people were within a block of each other. Amazing. Now, interestingly, we had heart rate monitors on little watches. And we were actually able to show, even though you might not know what these things indicate, basically the fact that these change scores are in the way that they are shows that these people were less stressed, more relaxed, and felt better after the walk in a green place than in the gray place. So this means that the design of even where we go walking can have a lasting impact on our arousal and satisfaction in a given walk. So we've been working with a local transit advocacy group called RVA Rapid Transit, using the FLIR cameras to go out and measure the intensity of cooling brought on by different bench and shelter types in the city of Richmond, and are now helping the GRTC transit agency prioritize stops with high amounts of ridership, high amounts of low socioeconomic ridership, and extremely hot temperatures from the heat mapping campaign to then dispatch new shade structures. So we are using these data with a local advocacy organization to provide new shade for people to wait for the bus in a dignified manner. We've also had the opportunity to do dozens of community-driven tree projects. What do I mean community-driven? If you just show up somewhere with a bunch of trees and you say, here you go, some people are going to be like, don't do that. I actually don't want your trees. I'm afraid of a branch hitting my car. I'm afraid of somebody hiding behind this tree and potentially mugging me. I don't want the bugs that are associated with it. There are a lot of reasons why someone wouldn't want a tree. Community-driven tree projects are instead dreamt up by the community themselves. They actually request the trees. They opt into the tree program. They describe what kind of tree that they want. They're given the opportunity to see what 3 different tree species look like in 30 different years. Like 30 years from now, what does this tree look like? What does this tree look like? What does this tree look like? And then they themselves are included in the planting, maintenance, and care of those trees for the first 2 years, and they're compensated. We pay residents to take care of their own trees. That way, they don't see the lack of investment from the city that has left their neighborhood behind. Now, also probably the most proud moment of the last few years was that the mayor actually said, hey, we have the lack of green space and public green spaces that in the south side of Richmond, the red line area that had significantly more temperatures. He dedicated 5 new parcels of land that were owned by the city but not used for anything to new green spaces, new parks. That was back in 2020. It's taken 4 years for us to get the money to do the community engagement around co-designing a new park. 2 of the green spaces have now been cleared out for invasive species. It was so cute, we had goats do it. And then they walked the neighborhood association members from the adjacent neighborhood around the space to get an idea of what they wanted to see and what kind of activities they wanted to do in that space. So this was just from a couple weeks ago. My colleague Amy Wentz from Southside Relief, if you're interested in uplifting stories about greening for and by people in the neighborhoods most affected, please follow Southside Relief. Lastly, I want to leave you with the program that I'm working on at Groundwork USA. It's called Climate Safe Neighborhoods, and it's rooted in the idea that we should invest in these communities for a long time to best help them develop the skills and capacity to advocate for themselves, to actually show up into the civic process and make a meaningful attempt, and even sometimes in many places in our network, we've actually shown an increase in investment for equitable climate adaptation. Basically, we do what we just did. We unpack the history of the place. We have the residents design and understand the changes. Sorry for the weird slide here. And then actually build the capacity of those neighbors to engage in the civic process. So just Tuesday night in the city of Boston, 7 months of work with 3 trusts across the state of Massachusetts got together to prioritize interventions based on community collected data that they've been collecting all summer. And so they had maps of their data. Here's me, my team from the Science Museum of Boston, and my lovely coworkers at Groundwork USA. We had so much engagement. You can see people pointing at maps. They got to put stickers where they want to do things. And now they're going to take that back and collaboratively decide where to install trees, rain barrels, and potentially advocate for other solutions that they want to participate in. So that is something I'm super proud of. It was just the other day before coming here, and now I get to share that with you. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm hopeful some of you have questions about what you've just heard. Thank you very much for allowing me to. Nobody ever asks me questions because it's so convincing. Just kidding. Dr. Wolf?
You have told a few of us that you've had the wonderful opportunity to take some of your knowledge and discuss it with the White House. Can you describe what those initiatives will lead to?
Yeah, so over the last few years, because of this work, it's attracted obvious, or very rightly so, attention from federal agencies. I've had the opportunity to engage with the EPA, the DOT, HUD, and got invited to the White House a couple times to talk amongst other experts in this field about solutions that could be implemented for these sorts of things. So a few years ago, it was about the USDA's Urban and Community Forestry Program, which unleashed $2 billion with a B, $billion in urban and community forestry money dedicated for use in urban environments. And with the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Biden administration mandated that 40% of that be used for these for benefits for low-income communities, also known as the Justice 40 program. So that's one thing that I've been able to share this information with. There's also been 2 or 3 policymakers that have put bills into Congress citing this work, including the SHADE Act from Bonnie Watson Coleman, who represents New Jersey. And Cory Booker actually references this work too. Then just a couple weeks ago, I've been able to start to use drones. I didn't include any of the photography from that now, but we're starting to utilize drones to see how our projects go from unbuilt to built and show the story of the transformation of these parcels. I was invited to go and talk about environmental surveillance for public health improvement, and got to sit with members of the CDC, the Department of Interior, and the Department of Energy, talking about really innovative ways to collaborate across space and time to track environmental outcomes. I was there as an expert in urban microclimatology. So yeah, this work, and I think truly my ability to present, which you are all learning how to do here at Augustana College, put me on this trajectory. Being able to communicate what I mean, what I know, and what I want to do about it is something that I learned how to do at Augustana College. And so I'm so proud to be able to represent not only Augie, but everything, the organizations that I represent in places like that, because I know that it can go and do something really powerful and good in the world. So that's been very fun. Thank you for listening. Yes, I'll come to you next.
What specifically can you do to help these underprivileged communities, like all the small tech?
Yeah. So I think there are lots of things. First is to understand where your spheres of influence lie. Nobody's asking you to take on the world, right? And I don't think any of us should feel that we have to do so much. There's only so much attention, so much time, so much money, so much anything that you can dedicate to something as big as this problem. So I think taking internal stock of where your spheres of influence lie, if it's something as simple as your dorm, your roommates, make a decision to do something differently, like a meatless Monday. I know it seems really weird, and like, oh yeah, that'll do a lot. But actually, people's diet in the United States are one of the main contributors to their carbon footprint, which I know the carbon footprint is rooted in a marketing firm ploy for the oil and gas companies, but nevertheless, it's a useful way to measure our contributions to those things. But the something as simple as changing up the way that we decide to consume things, especially on campus, where we have food halls that have immense amounts of food waste. That would be one way that you all can band together, make a personal decision, make a bit of a group decision, and then potentially influence an institution in that way. So again, I think about things, the solutions that we hear about a lot have to do with our personal lifestyles, but how can your spheres of influence, the people you're around, how can we start to have conversations where we're vilifying each other for doing something like flying, instead we're giving each other props for doing a meatless Monday. I think changing our viewpoint of what climate action means and the kinds of places that we can intervene are really important. So I encourage you also think about, the levels of like your person, your friends, and then the institution or the place that you're in are 3 different levels that you have a way of influencing. And it's going to take a bunch of 1% solutions to get to 100%. So don't let something small make you think that you can't do something about it. Yes.
I was going to ask if you know if anything like this has been happening in Chicago, like I guess for instance, putting green spaces in Chicago, because I do know that every year it's still really, really hot there.
Yeah. So interestingly, Chicago is kind of after the heat wave in 1995, and almost 800 people died. They made some significant changes to the way that they notify people or prepare for the response to heat. That has included a really huge investment in green roofs on new buildings and municipal buildings. So City of Chicago has some of the most prevalent. If you go up on one of the rooftops downtown, you look around, you see a lot of green roofs. In fact, they were able to show that they were able to, at least in the method that they used, change a little bit of the albedo of the city from a satellite perspective over like a 10 or 15 years span of time. But then also, the city of Chicago actually just used our heat mapping campaign last summer. It's called, if you look up Chicago Heat Watch, you'll see how many different organizations participated in using and implementing our method in the city of Chicago last summer in collaboration with the health department and Northwestern. Yeah.
We have an online question, Jamie?
Online question.
Yeah, I'll read it to you.
First, long-time listener, first-time caller.
Yeah. For the collaborative component of urban reforestation, new green space design, etc., how is that process facilitated so that residents become both aware and engaged in the projects? It's from Amber Andrews.
Wow. So there's a few different. The thing that we used, Amber, you can see. How's it going, Amber? It's been a while. So there's a couple different ways. The first is like when the city got their new urban and community forestry grant, they hired the community-based organizations that work in those neighborhoods to start doing the outreach to the neighbors themselves. So it's not the city showing up to these spaces. It's actually reinforcing the ongoing programming of the organizations at work. Like this Southside Relief, for example, has been leading a lot of that engagement. Then the sustained kind of training and engagement is through the training, planting, and tree care, which are regular check-ins with those same community-based organizations. So there's a presence of these people that are of and from the community, training, implementing, and checking in on that kind of process. Also through that, they are able to advocate then trained in making a statement at city council about the continued investment into these things. So it's a really multi checkpoint plan for how to get people involved and then continue to facilitate their participation.
Cool, thanks.
Nice to see you, Amber. Other questions? Don't be shy. Yes.
As some of the geology applications, such like how did you band into this climate change environment, like how like that.
Unpredictably. So I went to Oregon State for my PhD, and I was studying paleoclimatology. So I was looking at how patterns of Earth's climate history can inform the present and potentially help us understand what the future might look like. And the techniques that I was using to understand pattern over time and space in Earth's history were directly applicable to questions of the present. It's the same kinds of GIS, same kinds of spatial statistics, same kinds of tools that I was using, I was able to transfer over once I made the jump. But I was in my PhD program, and maybe some of the PhDs in the room would be willing to admit that somewhere along your PhD program, you start to question who you are and why you're doing what you're doing. It's a very hard thing to do a PhD. And I was really disillusioned by the type of, by the competition that I was having with my colleagues. You know, there was 70 of us on this summer workshop, but there were only 2 positions in paleoclimatology that were open that year. And so we're all sitting there like, we're in trouble of not having employment. And so I really wanted to choose, and at the same time, I was engaging in a lot of public engagement opportunities. I love to give talks about what I do. I love to share science with people. And so I have begun volunteering at a local science museum in Portland, Oregon, the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry. And through that, I built relationships with program managers, and they actually asked me to give a keynote for a visiting workshop conference that they were hosting at the museum. And I learned about a new job that was being offered at the Science Museum in Richmond, Virginia. I had never been to Richmond, Virginia. And so it was really, I saw 2 paths. One led me into the academic track, trying to chase, you know, the limited amount of faculty positions, the currently dwindling amount of faculty positions, or take a risk on this passion that I was feeling about communicating science and creating experiences for people to understand more about the world around them. And so I took a risk. I said, I will move to Richmond and try something new. Sometimes the path that we're supposed to take is actually the one that's the most uncertain and scary. And I was really scared of failing. I was really scared of being out of science. I was really scared. But look, I graduated with my PhD, and then I built a whole new research focus from the ground up. And that was because I took a risk. So don't be afraid of taking that risk and looking at those options and choosing the one that's exciting. Other questions? Well, if you did want to ask a question, but you're not someone that's really stoked about asking it in front of a bunch of people, feel free to email me. I'd be happy to answer a question that you have. Yeah, thanks again.